free on Amazon Music.
In an operating room in Los Angeles, California, an optic surgeon stood over his patient, a 9-year-old girl. He lifted his pair of specialized forceps, which are kind of like tweezers, and he opened up the 2 blades, sliding them carefully into either corner of her eye socket. Then he gently grabbed on to her eyeball with these forceps, and slowly he pulled her eyeball out of its socket until he heard the pop of air and the squish of soft tissue, which told him the eye was now fully dislodged from the socket. Now, only the thick optic nerve still attached the eyeball to the girl's skull. The surgeon turned the eye over until he was looking at the back of it, and there he saw a hard, black mass on the inner part of the eyeball. He touched the mass gently. It was so thick that for a moment, the doctor wasn't sure how he was going to remove it. He needed to use enough force to get it off his patient's eye, but it would be very easy to overdo it and cause serious damage. So he had to proceed with extreme caution. With an even smaller set of forceps, the surgeon pinched the black mass and slowly began to tease it off the little girl's eye. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please tell the follow button you'll teach them how to play golf, and immediately after their first tee, call the marshal and complain they are playing too slowly. This episode is called Jade's Eye. In March of 2013, 9-year-old Jade Howe sat in the nurse's office at her elementary school in Kona, Hawaii. It was the annual vision screening at her school, and Jade was busy telling the visiting optometrist all about the cupcake her mom packed her for lunch and how excited she was for hula dancing class after school. The optometrist laughed and asked Jade to sit up straight so he could examine her. Jade straightened her back and smiled as the optometrist dimmed the lights and then shined a flashlight into her left eye. Right away, Jade flinched. The light made her head hurt a little, but then her eyes adjusted. She was used to eye exams. She had worn glasses for most of her life, so she knew what to expect. Normally, she would just read charts on the wall while the optometrist gave her different lenses to try. But today was different. She'd had a headache off and on all morning, and her vision felt blurred, like everything was fuzzy around the edges. So it was harder than usual for her to read all those charts. The optometrist clicked his tongue a few times like he was thinking through a problem, and Jade got the feeling that something might be wrong. Just as Jade was about to ask if everything was okay, the optometrist handed her a black plastic spatula and told her to use it to cover up her right eye. Then the doctor held up a sheet of paper with rows of letters on it and asked her to read the lines aloud using just her left eye. But when Jade put that spatula over her right eye, her vision from her left eye became so blurred that she could barely see anything at all. She lowered the spatula and inspected it as if the spatula was to blame. But when she saw no issue with the spatula, she just put it right back over her right eye, but again, she could barely see out of her left eye. She asked the optometrist what happened to her left eye, but the optometrist just scribbled on a pink notepad and ripped off the paper, and he handed it to Jade and told her to give it to her parents the moment she got home from school. That afternoon, when school let out, Jade ran to her mother, Ho Ola'i Berman, who was standing on the sidewalk waiting for her. Jade immediately handed her mother the optometrist's report and watched a worried look come over her face as she read it. Jade asked her mom if something was wrong with her eyes, but her mom just smiled and told her not to worry. They'd schedule an appointment with the optometrist when they got home. Jade very likely just needed new glasses. Jade felt very relieved and just nodded, and then she shifted her focus and just began digging through her backpack for her lunchbox. She had saved a fruit roll-up for the walk home. Usually, Jade and her mother would stop at a park near their house to play and unwind after school, but today, when they got to that park, Jade didn't really feel like playing. She still had a headache and she could barely see out of her left eye, so she ended up just sitting in the sandbox eating her snack. Jade was absent-mindedly digging in the sand when a dog wandered over to say hello. She had seen this dog before. It was a stray, and it was a little scraggly looking, but it was always friendly, and Jade knew it loved belly rubs. And so after a few minutes of playing, the dog wandered off to a garbage can to look for food, and then Jade's mom came over and sat down beside Jade and asked her how she was feeling. Jade didn't answer. She just leaned over and put her aching head in her mother's lap. She was relieved when she heard her mom say that it was time to go home. A few days later, Jade's mother, Ho'ola'i, sat in the corner of an optometrist's office watching him finish up Jade's eye exam. The optometrist switched off the lights and smiled at Jade, and then said he'd actually like to take some x-rays. Jade's mom was a little surprised, but agreed to any extra cost if it helped her daughter see. The optometrist took the x-rays right there in his office, and 15 minutes later, they all gathered around his computer screen, looking at the enlarged images of Jade's left eye. To Jade and her mother, the image they were looking at just kind of looked like a big grape with veins running through it. But the optometrist immediately pointed at a small black mass located on the retina at the back of Jade's left eye. He was certain that this black mass was causing Jade's vision loss. The retina's job is to focus the eye, and so the mass was clearly getting in the way. But he wasn't sure what the mass was. The best thing to do was treat it like an infection and start Jade on antibiotics. Then they could see if that cleared it up and go from there. On the car ride home, Jade complained that her headache was back. Her mom sighed and said that it sounded like something only ice cream could fix. Jade smiled and started bouncing with excitement in her seat. Ho'ola'i laughed as she started driving towards the nearest ice cream shop, convinced that her daughter would feel better in a few days. But after a week, Jade was not feeling any better. Her head still hurt, and she could barely see out of her left eye. So her mom called the optometrist, who told her it was time for them to go see a doctor who has a specialty in these types of issues. The next morning, Jade's mom sat beside her dad, Jack, in the eye specialist's office. Jade curled up on her father's lap, playing a game on his phone while they waited for test results and x-rays. A moment later, a stout man in a lab coat walked into the office and sat on a stool opposite Jade and her parents. He pulled the stool closer to his desk, pulling Jade's x-rays up on his computer screen and flipping through a clipboard on his desk. He told Jade's parents that the antibiotics had not cleared up the black mass on Jade's eye. Then he pointed to the dark spot on Jade's x-ray. The doctor explained that the mass behind Jade's eye appeared to be inflamed, and when he compared the x-ray taken that morning to the x-ray taken last week, the mass really seemed to be growing bigger, which meant that Jade's sight loss would likely only get worse. Her headaches might become more severe too, and if the mass got too swollen, Jade could lose all sight in that eye. Jade's mom suddenly felt a lump in her throat as she asked the doctor what could be done. The doctor looked over at Jade with a hint of pity on his face, and then he said that he'd like to try injecting steroids directly into the mass, which would hopefully reduce the swelling and clear up the mass completely. It was a scary-sounding procedure, he said, but it would be done with anesthesia and it would only take a minute. And once it was over, Jade really should be cured. Jade would have this procedure done, but 2 days later, when Jade and her mother, Ho'ola'i, returned for a follow-up appointment, the specialist walked into the examination room with a glum expression on his face, and he told them that the injection had not worked. And worse than that, he said he was out of ideas. They were going to have to find a new doctor. And so over the next few weeks, Jade and her mother visited 3 other eye specialists, but none of them could figure out what was causing this black mass on Jade's left eye either. Jade's mother was really frustrated and very upset. She remembered what the first specialist had said about her daughter potentially losing all the sight in her eye, and so now she felt like if they didn't find an answer soon, it would just be too late. By the time Jade and her mother found themselves waiting anxiously in the exam room of the most experienced eye doctors on the island, it had been almost 3 months since Jade's eye began to hurt, and both Jade and Ho'ola'i were fighting a growing feeling of hopelessness. Jade's mom would never give up on her daughter, but she was tired and scared. The door finally opened, and a tall man with short black hair and a prominent chin strode inside. His name was Dr. Eugene Ng, and he was a retina surgeon. He squatted down in front of Jade and asked her gently if he could look at her eyes. Jade smiled and nodded and let go of her mother's hand. Her mother felt relief rise in her chest. She liked Dr. Ng immediately, and it was clear Jade did too. But as Dr. Ng shined a flashlight into Jade's eyes and conducted a few quick tests, Jade's mother tried to tamp down her optimism. This was the same thing every other doctor had done, and when Dr. Ng clicked off his flashlight and stood up, she braced herself to hear him say, "Well, there's nothing we can do. Go find another doctor." But, unlike all the other eye specialists, Dr. Ng said he was fairly certain he knew what was wrong with her eye. Jade's mother could barely believe this. She smiled and let herself hope, just for a second, that finally her daughter would get the help she needed. But then she realized that Dr. Ng was not smiling back at her. Instead, he looked almost grim as he told her that while he could diagnose Jade's problem, nobody in all of Hawaii had the expertise to actually fix it. Jade needed immediate medical attention that was not available on the islands, so she would have to be flown to the mainland of the United States as soon as possible. A week later, Jade sat with her mother in the back of an Uber that was driving them from the Los Angeles International Airport to their hotel. Jade watched the other cars on the highway blur past and noticed how beige and concrete everything looked in Southern California compared to the lush green of Hawaii. Jade was really missing her father. Jack had had to stay home in Hawaii to work, and he was also going to miss Jade's birthday, which was in 2 days. Jade dreaded the idea of turning 10 without her father around, and she also dreaded seeing another specialist that afternoon. Even though her left eye was now completely blurry and her headaches had only been getting worse, Jade was scared of going to see another doctor. She was afraid that whatever treatment they would give her would be more painful and more uncomfortable than what she was already experiencing. But Jade tried to push her worry from her mind. After all, she was in the city where all her favorite movies were made. Her mom had even promised her that they could go do some sightseeing when they weren't at the doctor's office. And so Jade decided she was just going to have fun on this trip no matter what. That afternoon, Jade sat in another examination chair, this time at the Children's Retina Institute in Los Angeles. A doctor with red hair and a neatly trimmed beard was drawing blood samples from Jade's arm, while Jade told him all about the last time she'd been poked with a needle and how much it had hurt. The doctor's name was Dr. Khaled Tawanzi, and Jade's mother had told Jade that he was actually the one who started this institute. Jade watched the blood flow from her arm down through a plastic tube and into small vials. It didn't hurt at all, and Jade actually found it fascinating to watch. She asked Dr. Tawanzi what he was going to do with her blood, and he smiled at her. He explained that he'd send her blood to a very special laboratory where scientists would run all kinds of tests. Then, in a day or two, they'd know for sure if Dr. Ng was right about what was causing the blindness in her left eye. Jade imagined an all-white laboratory full of shiny machines and scientists in blue scrubs. She'd seen something like that in a movie once. It made her feel safe, like the best doctors in Los Angeles would be working to save her vision. Dr. Tawanzi told Jade that in the meantime, her very important assignment was to have as much fun in Los Angeles as possible. Jade smiled as her mom assured him that they had plenty of plans for that. 2 days later, Jade peered over the side of a tour trolley, watching a shark's fin move through a man-made pool set to the iconic Jaws movie soundtrack. It was her 10th birthday, and her mother had taken her to Universal Studios Hollywood. Just as the music reached a crescendo, an animatronic shark came leaping out of the water. Jade leaped back from the edge of the trolley, and then she laughed and clapped with the rest of the tour group. By the time Jade and her mother got off the trolley a few minutes later, Jade felt better than she had in a long time. For just a moment, she had forgotten all about her troubles. She decided it was birthday magic. As she led her mother away from the studios tour, Jade heard her mother's cell phone ring. She turned to look at her mom, and Ho'ola'i dug through her purse, pulled out her phone. She looked at the caller ID and asked Jade to wait a minute. It was Dr. Tawanzi calling. Jade sat down on a nearby green plastic bench while her mom paced and listened. Jade watched as the smile on her mother's face faded. Jade's stomach lurched. She knew that whatever news her mother was receiving, it could not be good. Jade swung her legs nervously as her mother hung up with the doctor and then made a second phone call, which was much shorter. And when her mother turned around, Jade could tell she was extremely upset. Ho'ola'i strode over and sat on the bench next to her daughter. Jade held her breath as her mom explained what the doctor had told her. Jade needed surgery. Jade felt tears well up in her eyes as she asked her mother if the surgery would actually save her eyesight. Her mom frowned and struggled to find the right words. Finally, she explained that they didn't know if this procedure could actually save her eyesight. But without this surgery, it was fairly likely that she could lose her entire left eye. If that happened, she would have to have a glass eye instead. Jade tried to picture the doctor cutting out her eye and what it would feel like with a glass ball in her eye socket. The very thought of it sent tears running down her face, and she turned to her mom and sobbed into her chest. The next morning, Jade's mother stood next to Jade's gurney at the Children's Retina Institute. Jade looked frightened and kept looking around for her father, who had gotten on the first plane available to come join them. Jack was supposed to have landed more than an hour ago, and Jade's mother was worried he would miss the surgery. Ho'ola'i squeezed her daughter's hand as Dr. Tawanzi propped open the double doors that led to the operating room. He asked Jade if she was ready, and her mother beamed proudly as Jade nodded her head bravely. Then they heard a commotion down the hall. They all turned to see Jade's dad, Jack, burst into the hallway and run toward the gurney. When Jack reached them, he leaned down and planted a big kiss on Jade's forehead. He whispered in Jade's ear happy birthday and that he loved her. Finally, a nurse said it was time to take Jade into surgery, and so Ho'ola'i and Jack both blew kisses at their daughter as she was rolled into the operating room. The parents held each other as they watched the doors swing closed. It all felt so unfair. Their daughter was barely 10 years old, and she might lose her eye. And now all they could do was wait and hope. In the operating room, Dr. Tawanzi waited until Jade was completely asleep before using a speculum, which is like a small vice grip, to pry open her left eyelid. Once her eyelid was propped open, Dr. Tawanzi began the careful process of removing Jade's eye completely from its socket so that only the optical nerve was connecting it to her body. Once Dr. Tawanzi had freed Jade's eyeball from its socket, he held it up and turned it around until he was looking at the back. He had seen scans of the mass on Jade's eye, but he was still shocked by how it looked in person. It was a thick, dark mass, and it was caked on so hard it felt like a rock. Dr. Tawanzi could tell it was going to be extremely difficult to remove it without permanently injuring Jade's eye, because the doctor knew there was a risk that this mass was not just on Jade's eye, it might be embedded inside of Jade's eye. And if that was the case, Jade would very likely lose her eye entirely no matter what Dr. Tawanzi did. But Dr. Tawanzi would not know how bad this was until he attempted to remove it. It took Dr. Tawanzi nearly 3 hours to remove this foreign mass from Jade's eyeball, slowly pulling it off one tiny piece at a time. It almost felt like he was tearing cardboard with each pull. But finally, with one last gentle pull, the last of the black lump dislodged. Dr. Tawanzi placed it all on a dish, and a nurse whisked it away for testing. Then he lifted Jade's eyeball with his forceps and slid it back into the socket, hoping it could be saved. The first thing Jade saw when she woke up was her parents' smiling faces. However, she only saw them through her right eye. A protective patch was covering her left eye following the surgery. Jade felt groggy, but she was so relieved to see her parents, especially her dad, who told her she looked so cool, like a pirate. But then Jade began to panic as she touched her patch and wondered if she still even had an eye behind it. Was there a glass eyeball now? But her mom took Jade's hand and told her, don't worry, she still had her eye. Dr. Tawanzi was able to save it. Jade smiled huge with relief. Her mom was crying and told Jade what a great job she did. A few moments after that, Dr. Tawanzi walked into the recovery room. Jade and her family grinned and thanked him for his help. But Dr. Tawanzi said they were not out of the woods yet. He told Jade and her parents that Dr. Ng had been right about his diagnosis. Jade's condition was much more dangerous than anything doctors in Hawaii could treat, and the surgery was not a guaranteed solution. Because Jade's eyeball had been invaded by living creatures. The creatures, he said, were parasites called Toxocara, otherwise known as roundworm. Dr. Tawanzi explained that usually Toxocara is spread through dog feces. He asked if Jade had a pet dog at home. Jade said no, but then she told Dr. Tawanzi about the stray dog that she sometimes played with at the local park. Dr. Tawanzi nodded and said that it was very possible to pick up Toxocara at a park frequented by stray dogs, or even just by pets and their owners. All it would take for Jade to get this infection would be for her to touch a tiny bit of dirt with dog feces on it, and then touch her mouth. Toxocara is not rare. In fact, they are one of the most common parasites in the world. About 5% of American adults have antibodies in them that show they have been exposed at some point in their lives to Toxocara. But most people who ingest Toxocara eggs don't get a single symptom and never even know the parasite was inside of them at all. Typically, the body forms a hard shell around the parasite and expels through the intestines. But in some cases, the body is too slow to react, and the parasites migrate through the body and end up in organs like the liver, kidneys, and sometimes even the eyes. And that's what had happened to Jade. She had developed a very rare condition called ocular toxocariasis. In ocular toxocariasis, the body does finally form that protective shell around the parasites, but only after the parasites have attached themselves to the eye. That's why the mass on the back of Jade's eye was so hard. Her body was trying to protect her, just a little too late. Jade got lucky. Her body's response had come in time to stop the parasites before they completely destroyed her eye. And Dr. Tawanzi was pretty sure he managed to remove every last parasite from her body. Still, he told Jade and her parents that she would have to be watched very closely in the days ahead to make sure he had not missed any. Most of Dr. Tawanzi's explanation went way over Jade's head, but she grimaced at the disgusting thought of accidentally eating dog poop, and Dr. Tawanzi actually laughed a little bit when he saw Jade's face. He told her it's much more common than you think. Just make sure you always wash your hands after the playground and you'll be okay. Jade grinned as a wave of relief washed over her. She was ready to be done with doctor's offices and dog poop. A few days later, the family all flew back home to Hawaii. Jade's eyesight in her left eye would come back. However, it really never fully recovered. But other than her vision, she would be okay. Jade would go on to be a cheerleader for her high school, and she would also continue to dance hula.
In 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son, Eldridge, traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away Betty went inside, handed her son to her mom, and went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. Now, Eldridge loved going to his granny's house because she had this enormous backyard for him to play in. If you were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass for him to run around in, and it butted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, looking straight out at the forest, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal, and there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed, you could clearly see. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed, so long as he didn't go right or left in the creek, which would put him out of view from anybody on the porch. And so this particular day, when Eldridge and his grandmother went outside, Eldridge wanted to go play in the creek bed. So he immediately starts running across the yard towards it, along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she just didn't have it in her to go all the way down to the creek bed, so she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. She remembers watching her grandson go all the way across the yard, get to the break in the trees, and then step down into the creek bed where he began goofing around with the dogs and throwing rocks and having a good time, clearly in view. And for the next 5-10 minutes, she just stared directly at her grandson and the dogs. And at some point, she picked up the book next to her and she began reading the book and then periodically looking up to check on her grandson and then back down to the book. At about 2 p.m., she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson yell out for help. Now, 3-year-olds yell out for help all the time. Sometimes it's a big deal and sometimes it's not such a big deal. But oftentimes the sound of their voice gives away how serious it is. No matter what they say, it's like their tone gives away, should I take this seriously or is this just a kid being a 3-year-old? And she would say that the way he was yelling sounded like a real emergency. When she poked her head up, even though she had seen him, less than a minute ago playing in the gap in the trees, now she's looking and he and the dogs are gone. And so of course she's alarmed. She hops out of her seat, she goes down the steps, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. And she's yelling his name and she's walking quickly. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again, except this time his voice was coming from way off in the forest, way farther away from the last time he had yelled out. It gave the impression to her that he had moved a great distance from the last time he yelled to her, and it triggered something inside of her that was telling her something is terribly wrong. And she began running towards the creek bed. Still no sign of the dogs. She can't see anything. She's just running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a third time, barely audible, way off in the forest. He yells out for help, and as he's yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops, and she looks out in front of her, and it's just dense forest, and there's no Eldridge, there's no dogs, there's nothing. She looks to her right down the creek bed, and there's nothing down there, and then she looks to her left, and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away, facing away from her, and the dog is positioned in such a way that it's clearly looking at something. And so she runs down to the dog thinking she's going to see maybe Eldridge or the other dogs, but there's nothing beyond the dog. The dog is just rooted to the spot. Its hair is raised, it's growling, and it's taking little steps back like it's been spooked at whatever it's seen or whatever it's looking at. And she just looked up and tried to look in the direction the dog was looking, but there was nothing. It was just forest. And so at this point, she felt certain that someone must have abducted Eldridge. And so she turns, she tries to pull the dog to come with her, but the dog's not budging. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The two of them come back down to the creek bed. The dog is still in the same position, growling and staring in the same direction, as if whatever it's looking at hasn't gone anywhere. And they look for a couple more minutes. They're yelling for Eldridge, and the grandmother is telling her daughter, look, I think he's been abducted. We gotta call the authorities. And finally she relents, and so they do manage to get the dog. They run back to the house and they call the police. Shortly thereafter, the state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers, and they immediately went down to the creek bed where they started pushing predominantly to the left side, which is where the dog was angled, and it was also where the grandmother had heard her grandson yelling from. And very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. They were in some sand right at the edge, and they were walking away as if he was leaving the area he had been told to stay in, which was in that gap in the trees. But interestingly, the footprints, it looked like he had been walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters when inexplicably the prints just stop, as if he stopped in the sand where he was. But had he gone right, left, straight, turned around, had he gone in any direction, there would have been additional prints in the sand, but there wasn't, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. For the rest of the day and that night, they would not find any more signs of Eldridge or the other two missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, there were a number of search crews that had gone well outside of the primary search area in hopes of maybe finding one of the two lost dogs, because they thought maybe they could bring them to the lost child. And this one crew that was 4 miles away from where Eldridge had gone missing, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, which had fairly deep water, and they get to this clearing and they see there's this rocky overhang with high grass all around it, kind of forming like a cave. And they hear this whimpering again, and it's coming from underneath that rock. And they rush over and they're pulling the grass aside, and sure enough, tucked underneath this rock, inside of this kind of makeshift cave, is Eldridge. He was laying on this really well-constructed bed of leaves that looked like an animal's den. So either Eldridge had found an animal's den or he had built himself this beautiful bed of leaves. When they approached him, he was sleeping underneath this rock. And so that whimpering sound he was making, he must have been making in his sleep. And so as they got closer to him, he woke up and he kind of sat up and he's very groggy and confused. All of his clothes were really badly torn up and he wasn't wearing any shoes, but he overall seemed okay. He just was very confused seeming. And so they scooped him up and they brought him back to search headquarters, reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone's just so relieved that he's alive. But at the same time, people were like, how did he get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp? And so after the doctor cleared him, saying he was okay, besides some scratches and bruises, the police, along with the mother and the grandmother, sat down with Eldridge and asked him, what happened? But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. He didn't even know he had spent 24 hours out in the middle of the woods by himself. It was like he had blacked the whole thing out. Because Eldridge was found alive and unharmed, the police did not continue to investigate this case. And so we don't know what caused him to suddenly be yelling for help and appear to be drifting farther and farther into the woods. We don't know what the dog saw in the creek that scared it so badly. We don't know how Eldridge moved 4 miles through a dense forest over multiple swamps only to wind up in yet another swamp inside of a cave. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. It's just very fortunate he was found alive. Unfortunately, there's no clarification about what happened to the other 2 dogs, although the way it's worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. Their house was on a very quiet street with very few neighbors anywhere near them, and their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section of their backyard and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake infested. And Anna was terrified of snakes, and so she happily obliged. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up and Anna was gone. She immediately ran outside and she's yelling for her daughter. She's looking all around and she knows she must have gone into the forest, and she's thinking to herself, she must have been bit by a snake and she's laying on the ground somewhere. That's why I can't see her. And so she runs into the forest and she's screaming for her daughter and she's not getting any response. She's starting to panic. All her yelling has gotten the attention of her 2 older sons that were in the house. They come running outside and they join the search and they start fanning out and they're looking for Anna, and she's just gone. And so after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar that one of their own had gone missing, a child no less. And so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search, and they combed that whole forest behind their property, and there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. And within just hours of this change, there was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing, and they found Anna, and she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes. When they went up to her, she seemed okay. They picked her up and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her and the doctor said, there's no signs that she was attacked. There's really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It doesn't even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she wasn't able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she's only 2 years old. But the reason this case is included in today's video is not because, she vanished mysteriously in the forest and that she was actually found 3 miles away versus 1, or, that she was found with just a shoe on. The reason it's included in today's video is because for her to have been found where she was found, the only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. There was no other way for her to have gotten there. The only other way would have been a massive detour that she literally could not have covered. An adult probably couldn't have covered in the amount of time given. So this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. I mean, even if you take the barbed wire off of the fence, a 2-year-old climbing a large fence, that alone is kind of a Herculean task. And to do it without scratching your body, it's not possible. It's truly impossible. A May 7th article in the LA Times said the police were baffled by this 10 fence dilemma, and they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted or attacked or harmed in any way. It was just where she was found did not add up. Ultimately, the police came out with a statement saying this had to have been an accident, that Anna, the 2-year-old, managed to just somehow walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was, and thank goodness she's alive. But interestingly, the police confiscated her clothing and would not give that back to the parents, indicating there was further investigation happening even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed whether or not they actually discovered anything else about this case. And like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents did not press for more information about what happened to their daughter because she was found alive and unharmed. Now, Anna's case might seem like some crazy anomaly, and that's all it is. But this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. His mother estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds tops. The police and the community came out in force, and they combed through the woods, and they could not find any sign of Ronald. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up considering the timeline you've given us, which is you went inside for 10, 15 seconds and your son is now completely gone. He's completely vanished. Like, you must have something to do with this. And so the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests, and his parents passed all of them. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately, it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. People in the area believed someone or something, maybe a bear or some other animal, was lurking in the tree line and watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went in the house, they ran up and snatched the child and ran away with him. However, the police came out and said there was no evidence to back up that this child had been kidnapped, that what's far more likely is Ronald just got up and walked away and disappeared. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, these similarities between her case and Ronald's case were just too much for locals to overlook. And so people began saying, it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald. But Anna was just lucky enough to survive. Although this mystery predator theory is just that, a theory, it does seem more likely than Ronald in 15 seconds getting up and running off into oblivion, never to be found again, and Anna scaling 10 barbed wire fences in a 24-hour period without a scratch on her body. Unfortunately though, we'll probably never know the truth. In September of 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe, and Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the right to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the 2 boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley ready so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the two teenage boys had not seen a single elk, and so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area, and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait. And an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, still no sign of their dad. They can't get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they're thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he's got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. And so as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just the Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their mind. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he's trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager, and so we'll just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed, but more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to invincible Robert, that just didn't add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter is in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He's all alone. He's an experienced hunter, and he's not on a path. He's just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it doesn't really register with him. It's only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he couldn't see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. And so he starts walking towards the crow. He still can't see it. It's very thick vegetation, and he's getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It's in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It's like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over, and this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump. And the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he's kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter. And it recognizes the hunter can see the crow, and the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow, because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him. And he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. and the hunter's standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter's so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who's looking at him again, and the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up, and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and the skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull, it was also a human femur bone right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded, but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said actually he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly he wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree, so who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where is his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid, meaning had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So the fact that he wasn't found means either hundreds of people didn't see him, including a helicopter with thermal imager, or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many, many people do, then do you really think it's a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I don't know. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it.
You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. The middle-aged man felt angrier and angrier as he drove home from his latest doctor's appointment. The man had been to see the doctor 4 times about his breathing difficulties, and each time the doctor had taken chest x-rays, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. The doctor thought that, medically speaking, the man was fine, but the man knew he was far from fine. He couldn't even climb a flight of stairs without taking countless breaks to catch his breath, and once he got into bed, he could barely muster the strength to get back out again. He was now missing work, and he was feeling so weak that it was getting hard to do much of anything. And so how could any doctor say that he was fine? After he pulled into the driveway, the man just sat there for a moment. And as he did, he realized that the feeling he was having right now was not just a feeling of frustration. He also had a much darker feeling. And that feeling was that one of these nights he was going to go to bed and not wake up again. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please attach a very active hornet's nest to the inside of the Follow Button's toilet bowl, and then close the lid and walk away. The world can be a scary place, especially when it comes to getting sick. You could catch a virus at the gym, you could pick up a foodborne bacteria at your local restaurant, or you could even get bit by a deadly bug out for a walk on your favorite hiking trail. I mean, there are dangers everywhere, and so sometimes it just feels safer to stay at home, safe and sound on the couch. But in this episode, you'll hear 2 stories about people who found out just how dangerous staying home can actually be. Our first story is about a man in Scotland whose house becomes a living nightmare. And our second story is about a young man in Australia who found out that just sitting on your couch can actually become a health disaster. Here is our first story called A Step Too Far. On a Saturday afternoon in August of 2016, 43-year-old Philip Mackey dragged a ladder into his bathroom. Philip and his wife Marnie were working hard to fix up their home in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And Philip, frankly, spent a lot of his weekends on these types of home improvement projects, so this was very typical. Philip carefully opened up the ladder in a corner of the bathroom and climbed up. Once he was up there, Marnie handed him a spray bottle that contained water and bleach, and then she stood back to supervise from the doorway. Philip sprayed the mixture liberally onto a cluster of mold that had grown in the corner of the room. It occurred to him that he probably should wear a face mask, but it was too late for that now. When Philip was done, he tossed the spray bottle back down to Marnie, who caught it in one hand, and then laughed at what an efficient home improvement team they had become. Philip checked his watch, and to his surprise, it was almost 5 p.m. He realized he needed to jump in the shower right away. Philip played saxophone and guitar for a local band on the weekends, and they had a show tonight. He needed to get going soon if he wanted to be on time. So he moved the ladder out of the way and turned on the shower. "15 minutes later, Philip toweled off and pulled some clothes out of his closet. He laid them out on the bed next to their cat, who was fast asleep in a tight little ball. As Philip threw his shirt on, he took a moment to look around his bedroom. The fresh coat of paint that he and Marnie had applied to the room only a week ago made the room look so polished. They'd also hung new curtains and bought a cozy feather comforter and down pillows for the bed, and so they were really starting to turn their house into a home. Philip was now running late, so he buttoned his shirt as fast as he could as he hurried down the stairs. But when he got to the landing and reached for his jacket, he had to pause to catch his breath. Philip could feel his heart pounding. It had been a while since he'd been to the gym, but he hadn't realized he was this out of shape. He felt a little embarrassed, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Philip was in a hurry, so he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. By the time Philip walked into the pub down the road, his pulse was back to normal and he felt okay. The band would play a great show, but by the end of the show, Philip was once again totally out of breath. And so he decided he would just need to get more exercise because he was too young to get this winded so easily. A few days later, Philip got home from work around 5 p.m. He tossed off his jacket and bounded up the stairs to his bedroom. But once again, he felt his heart start to pound about halfway up the stairs, and he had to stop to catch his breath. Marnie appeared at the top of the landing and asked if he was okay, and Philip just shook his head and said no. But then he kind of playfully told her that, hey, I'm just totally out of shape. But one morning, 2 weeks later, Philip's problems got worse. He was walking up the stairs very slowly, trying not to spill his cup of coffee, and he had only made it up to the 3rd step when his vision became blurry and he suddenly felt very dizzy, and so Philip gripped the railing to keep from falling. Then Philip began to feel breathless, and so instinctively he just sat down and put his coffee down, and he hung his head between his knees for a few minutes until the dizziness passed. And then finally, when Philip was feeling normal again, but still just sitting there on the stairs, Philip was terrified, and so he rushed downstairs, he grabbed his phone, and he called the doctor to make an appointment. Later that week, Philip was sitting in his doctor's office. He had been coming to this general practitioner for years, and Philip trusted that he'd be able to help him. His doctor sat across from him on a stool, listening as Philip listed off his symptoms: shortness of breath, pounding heart, and dizzy spells. The doctor nodded and told Philip that he most likely had a lower respiratory infection. He He said there'd been a virus going around recently, and a lot of his patients had chest congestion. He was going to run some blood tests as well, just to be sure it wasn't anything serious. But in the meantime, the doctor said he would put Philip on antibiotics for a few days, which should help Philip feel like himself again. Philip thanked the doctor and then drove straight to the pharmacy to pick up the antibiotics. And by the next afternoon, Philip was starting to feel like he had some energy again. Also, his blood tests had come back clean, and so it seemed like the antibiotics were working. But the following evening, Philip came home from work feeling absolutely exhausted. He'd barely moved all day at the office, and yet here he was, feeling like he was going to fall asleep standing up. Philip made his way to the stairs, and he leaned hard on the railing as he took the first 2 steps, but immediately he could tell his heart was racing. He went up another couple of steps, but it felt like he had just sprinted a mile, and so he stopped and bent over and began wheezing for air. Finally, he just sat down on the steps, and he leaned back on his elbows and did his best to try to take slow, even breaths. But even still, it just felt like there was this huge weight on his chest that was keeping him from breathing in fully. After a few minutes, Philip heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and he knew it was his wife Marnie coming to help him. And a moment later, he felt her hand on his back, and he let her guide him to his feet. Philip leaned heavily on Marnie's shoulder as they slowly walked up 1 step at a time. And then when Philip finally made it upstairs and lurched into the bedroom, he looked at the clock and he realized it had taken him 30 minutes to climb the stairs. But at this point, Philip was so exhausted that he just collapsed into the bed and asked his wife to close the curtains. He was going to attempt to sleep off whatever was going on with him. Over the next 10 days, Philip carefully took the course of antibiotics his doctor had prescribed him, but now it just didn't seem like they were doing anything. He was tired and dizzy at work. He barely had the energy to make it through his band sets every weekend. He was out of breath and exhausted basically all the time. But Philip kept hoping that he'd eventually just feel better, that he would just kind of sleep this off. One morning in October, so about 6 weeks after Philip had finished his course of antibiotics, Philip opened his eyes and immediately struggled to sit up. He rested for a moment on his back with his feet dangling off the edge of the bed, and then when he tried to sit up again, he realized that he genuinely couldn't do it. He did not have the strength just to sit up in bed. But he was feeling so defeated that he just rolled over and yelled out to his wife to please call his office and let them know he was not going to be able to come into work. Then Philip just closed his eyes and slept for the entire rest of the day. But later that night at around 2 a.m., so technically the next morning, Philip did finally wake up, but when he did, he again felt that intense pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. Except this time, the pressure was so intense, he literally felt like he was suffocating. And Philip's flailing woke up his wife, and as soon as she looked over and saw her husband was having this emergency, she reached for her phone to call the hospital. But right at that exact moment, Philip's lungs relaxed just enough to allow him to take in a full breath of air. And so suddenly he was calmed down for a second, and he just grabbed his wife's arm and he told her, "Don't call an ambulance." Marnie was caught off guard by his request, and so she flipped on the light and just stared at her husband, but she did put the phone down. And she would agree not to call an ambulance, but she told Philip they were done waiting whatever this was out, that he would, very soon, need to seek out medical help. Several weeks later, Philip sat in his longtime doctor's office feeling frustrated and exhausted as he waited for yet another set of x-rays of his chest. He was hoping that this time, the x-ray would actually show them why he was struggling to breathe. But this was the 4th appointment he'd made this month, and each time so far, the x-ray had come back looking totally normal. And without fail, his doctor would tell him that, hey, everything looks fine, and Philip would go home without any answers. Now, Philip trusted that his doctor knew what he was doing, but Philip was feeling extremely anxious and upset that his medical issues were still going undiagnosed. Philip was now spending most of his time in bed asleep. He had no energy. He hadn't been to work in over a month. And if he didn't get better, he would not be able to go back to work at all. And that would plunge him and Marnie into financial crisis. But that was just their financial situation. Philip also could feel his body literally breaking down. He was worried that eventually whatever was going on with him was going to kill him. Philip looked up when the door to the exam room opened, and he saw his doctor walk in, shaking his head solemnly. The doctor cleared his throat and told Philip that, once again, his x-ray looked totally normal. When Philip heard this, he just kind of snapped. Months of exhaustion and anxiety had finally bubbled up, and he just began to cry. He told his doctor that he just couldn't go on like this. The doctor sighed and nodded, agreeing that Philip was way too young to be in such dire health. The doctor was starting to suspect that Philip might need the advice of a specialist. There was a nearby clinic that specialized in urgent respiratory conditions, and the doctor promised he would call them ASAP. Philip thanked the doctor, but truthfully, he was skeptical about whether the specialist could actually help. But at the same time, he welcomed a new perspective because he was starting to give up hope. Later that day, Dr. Owen Dempsey opened up an email from Philip's general practitioner. Dr. Dempsey was a highly respected chest physician at BMI Albin Hospital, which was located only 30 minutes up the road from where Philip lived. Half an hour earlier, Philip's doctor had called Dr. Dempsey to tell him that, Philip was suffering from extreme shortness of breath and exhaustion and needed help right away. Dr. Dempsey clicked on the email attachment, which was Philip's x-ray, and it popped up on the screen. Dr. Dempsey looked it over carefully. For the most part, Philip had healthy-looking lungs. However, something strange immediately jumped out at the chest physician. He noticed that Philip's lungs appeared slightly gray, almost like someone had shaded them in with a pencil. Now, Dr. Dempsey could understand why Philip's doctor had said that everything looked normal. The grayness was actually so faint that at first, he actually thought it was a defect in the x-ray film. And so, Dr. Dempsey could clearly see why Philip's doctor had said the x-rays looked normal, because they basically did. But with Dr. Dempsey's deep knowledge of the human chest, he knew that Philip's lungs were not normal at all. The slight grayness in Philip's lungs indicated they were inflamed and that something was seriously wrong. So Dr. Dempsey decided to call Philip and see if he could figure out if anything in his environment or daily habits might be making him sick. Dr. Dempsey dialed Philip's number. After 3 rings, Philip answered, and Dr. Dempsey noticed right away that Philip was panting. Dr. Dempsey had lung cancer patients who sounded better than Philip. Philip explained that the reason he was currently so out of breath was because he walked through his house to answer the phone. That was it. Dr. Dempsey was shocked, but when he told Philip how surprised he was at Philip's shortness of breath, Philip just laughed and said he was surprised too. He said it was getting really hard to think of himself as a healthy person now that he needed half an hour just to climb his own stairs. Dr. Dempsey knew that Philip must be incredibly stressed out, and he appreciated that Philip was actually still finding ways to make light of his situation. But as desperately as Dr. Dempsey wanted to help Philip out, he really had no idea how to do it. Dr. Dempsey told Philip that he believed he could be suffering from a severe allergic reaction. Things people have in their homes, like black mold or pet dander, can trigger severe and sometimes dangerous allergic reactions. And other times, people can bring things into their home from a trip that ultimately triggers an allergy. For a moment, all Dr. Dempsey heard was just wheezing on the other end of the line. And then Philip spoke, and he told the doctor that, for the past few months, he'd barely gotten out of bed, so he certainly wasn't traveling anywhere, even within his own community. And Philip couldn't think of anything in his house that could have caused such a terrible reaction. He said there was nothing new, just the same pets they'd had for years. Now, Philip did mention that there was some mold in their bathroom, but he'd taken care of it months ago and it never came back. The doctor eventually just began to quiz Philip about potential ways he could have been exposed. And time and again, Philip shot each of them down. Even before he got sick, Philip didn't go to a health spa or other humid environments where mold could grow. He rarely went into his attic, which can also harbor mold. And since he'd gotten sick, they'd stopped remodeling the house, so he definitely was not exposing himself to any kind of home improvement chemicals. Philip said he didn't even smoke. And so by the time Dr. Dempsey had gone through his whole checklist of hazards and come up empty, he could tell Philip was close to tears. And Dr. Dempsey totally understood. because if he were in Philip's position, he would be just as scared and frustrated. Dr. Dempsey felt stumped. Nothing Philip had been exposed to recently sounded like cause for concern. So he asked Philip about the work he was doing on his house before he got sick. And Philip began describing all the painting and reupholstering they'd been doing. And in the background, Dr. Dempsey could hear Philip's wife, Marnie, reminding Philip about all sorts of other small projects they'd taken on over the past year. And at some point, Philip began rambling about his bedroom, something he was obviously very proud of. And he would tell Dr. Dempsey that they had really splurged on linen curtains and a brand new comforter. And right at that moment, as he was describing his bedroom, Dr. Dempsey had an epiphany. He suddenly understood what very likely was making Philip so sick. And so he cut Philip off and said, "How soon can you come in and get blood work done?" A few days later, Philip and Marnie sat in Dr. Dempsey's office as they went over the results of Philip's recent blood work. Dr. Dempsey smiled at them and reassured them that he did finally have a diagnosis. Dr. Dempsey explained that, generally speaking, people do not suddenly become allergic to things that they're exposed to regularly, things like pets. And even if Philip did inhale that mold in the bathroom when he was doing those home renovations, his illness should have gone away when he was no longer exposed to the mold. But when Philip told Dr. Dempsey on that phone call that he and his wife were really excited about the changes they had made to their bedroom and they had splurged on the linens and the comforter on their bed, that is what tipped Dr. Dempsey off that potentially Philip could be suffering from a very specific and very rare disease. And it would turn out Dr. Dempsey's hunch was correct. Philip's blood tests had revealed that he was having a severe allergic reaction to bird feathers. This is known as hypersensitivity pneumonitis. But not feathers from a pet bird or birds in the yard. When Philip and Marnie redid their bedroom, they'd replaced their synthetic comforter and pillows with more expensive ones that were filled with feathers. Philip was allergic to the bed that he'd been laying in for months. That's why he kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker. The doctor explained that this very strange disease is quite rare, but it is so often triggered by people's bedding that medical professionals sometimes refer to this disease as feather duvet lung disease. Duvet is another word for comforter. Although Philip had never been bothered by feathers before, Dr. Dempsey told him that symptoms of hypersensitivity pneumonitis can develop quickly and worsen as time goes by. Without treatment, hypersensitivity pneumonitis can cause permanent damage to the lungs. But thankfully, Dr. Dempsey assured him that they had caught the disease in time. Dr. Dempsey prescribed Philip steroids, and Philip got rid of the feather comforter and pillows. Within 2 days, Philip was already feeling better. And within a few weeks, he was back at work and back to playing his saxophone in bars all across Scotland. And now for our second story, which is called Dying of Boredom. In December of 2019, 17-year-old Kyle Quitman took a deep breath of fresh air as a hospital volunteer wheeled him out the front door of a hospital in Queensland, Australia. Now, at the time, most of Kyle's friends were out celebrating the end of the school year. But Kyle had been in the hospital, having ankle reconstruction surgery to repair a really bad rugby injury. Kyle wished he could be at the beach right now with his friends, but after 3 days of being stuck inside the hospital, he was at least happy just to feel the sun on his skin. And it occurred to him that he really should try to enjoy this moment, because he was going to be mostly stuck inside for the next 3 months as his ankle healed, and while all his friends enjoyed the Australian summer that runs through February. The hospital volunteer parked Kyle's wheelchair on the curb and asked how his ankle was feeling. Kyle could feel it throb inside his cast, and he admitted that it was actually pretty tender. But a moment later, he saw his dad's car come around the corner, and suddenly he forgot all about the pain. All Kyle wanted was just to go home with his dad. Kyle's dad hopped out of the car and helped Kyle out of his wheelchair. Kyle's legs were a little shaky after 3 days on his back, but he leaned on his dad and managed to limp his way to the front passenger seat. Then off they went. The minute Kyle hobbled into his home, he could see that his mother had been carefully preparing for his arrival. She made the couch in the living room as inviting as possible, complete with fluffy pillows and his favorite blanket. There was a TV tray set up next to the couch with the TV remote, his gaming controllers, and a little bowl of candy sitting on it. Kyle smiled at all the amazing comforts his mother had assembled, but at the same time he sort of frowned because this was also where he knew he would be spending basically all of his time for the next 12 weeks, and as nice as it was, it felt pretty cramped. But in the end, Kyle just collapsed onto the couch, grabbed a controller, and started gaming. 4 days later, Kyle lay on the couch, a bowl of popcorn balancing on his stomach, as he listened to the family's pet cockatiel, Larry, repeat his name over and over again in a sing-song voice. Larry had a lot of personality, and Kyle loved to play with him. He had spent the morning trying to flick kernels across the living room and into Larry's cage. Kyle rolled a kernel in between his thumb and forefinger and then launched it across the room, and amazingly, it sailed right through the metal bars, right into the cage, and Kyle cheered as the cockatiel whistled his appreciation. But then Kyle sighed. Larry was amusing, but this had to be the most boring summer vacation of his life. A few of Kyle's friends had dropped by the night before with cookies and Gatorade, which was great, but then they all left for a party without Kyle, and he felt totally abandoned. In fact, the only person who spent any real time with him was his grandmother. She'd been coming over just about every single day to give Kyle cookies, and she would even play video games with him, but she was not good at video games. And Kyle really appreciated that, but again, he just felt totally bored and lonely. But perhaps the worst part of what Kyle was calling his, quote, couch arrest, was that he still had 77 more days of being stuck in here with nothing to do except wait for his ankle to heal. So, frustrated, Kyle grabbed another kernel and launched it into Larry's cage. A moment later, Kyle heard the garage door opening, and he knew that meant his mother was back with his 14-year-old brother, Dylan, and two of his friends. Within seconds, 3 14-year-olds zoomed past Kyle as he sat there on the couch, and they raced out to the indoor pool that was separated from the living room by a sliding glass door. Kyle huffed and sarcastically called after them to have fun, but he didn't need to worry. All 3 teens jumped into the pool and began roughhousing, splashing water, and having a great time. Kyle's mom, Sherry, came into the living room right behind the kids, carrying a few grocery bags. As Dylan and his friends shouted and splashed around in the background, Kyle's mother told him that she was so sorry he couldn't be outside this summer. Then Kyle watched as his mother opened Larry the cockatiel's cage and set the bird on the floor for his daily walk around the living room. And as Larry began picking up popcorn kernels in his beak and marching around the room, Kyle, for the first time in his life, felt jealous of a bird. The next morning, Kyle's throat felt scratchy as he slowly came down the stairs from his bedroom. And when he coughed, he could feel phlegm coming up into his throat. As if Kyle didn't have enough problems, now he realized that he must have caught a cold from Dylan or one of his friends who came over the day before. But luckily, Kyle's mother was basically a mind reader, because moments later, she came rushing into the living room where Kyle was, and she set a few throat lozenges down next to him. She told him she'd had a cough too the week before, and she promised Kyle that his cold would likely clear up in just a day or two. 3 days later, in mid-December, Kyle was sitting on the couch as usual playing video games. He had just won a match in his favorite fighting game when he started coughing. But this time he was coughing really hard. He tried to steady his breathing, but he was hacking so much that he felt like he was fighting just to get air. Kyle wondered if maybe he was hunched over too much and kind of compressing his diaphragm. So he sat up for a minute and then just lay down on his back. But even then, he still couldn't get a full breath, and in fact, it felt like he had just run up a flight of stairs. Eventually, Kyle did get his breathing under control, but those few panicky minutes really rattled him. Later that afternoon, Kyle was laying on his back with Larry the cockatiel on his chest. Kyle was petting the bird when he felt himself struggling to breathe again. Larry fluttered to the ground as Kyle doubled over in another coughing fit. After a moment, Kyle heard footsteps coming swiftly toward the living room, and he knew his mom had heard him coughing. Moments later, Kyle's mom came flying into the room, and she put the back of her hand against Kyle's forehead, and she said he was burning up. She wondered aloud if Kyle maybe had an infection or some other complication from his surgery. Then she told Kyle that if he wasn't feeling better in the morning, they were going back to the hospital. And sure enough, by the following morning, Kyle was much worse. His stomach felt upset and his sheets were damp with sweat. His head was pounding so hard that he couldn't even open his eyes. He called out for his mom and cracked his eyelid just enough to see her come into the room. Kyle asked her for some aspirin, but Sherry thought he needed more help than that. She was going to stick to her guns and take him back to the hospital. About an hour later, Kyle laid back on the table in an examination room, his hands over his face to block the overhead light from hitting his super sensitive eyes. A doctor looked over Kyle's chart and asked if he had traveled recently or been exposed to anyone who was sick. Kyle scoffed at the idea he had been traveling anywhere and told the doctor that he hadn't left the house for 10 days. But Kyle had to admit he had been around some sick people. His brother had been out and about with friends constantly, and he had come home with a cough just last week. Kyle's mom also chimed in and said she too had a cough last week, and in fact, now that she thought about it, she'd had a cough on and off quite a bit lately. But Sherry assumed she must have gotten it from Kyle's grandmother, who'd had a cold for weeks, and she came over all the time to visit. The doctor nodded and said that it was possible that Kyle had caught the same bug that had made other family members sick. But for some reason, Kyle's symptoms seemed to be much worse than anyone else's. The doctor asked Kyle to sit up, and once he had, he pressed his stethoscope to Kyle's back. Kyle tried to breathe deeply, but he felt like there was rattling in his chest, and it was hard to fully fill his lungs with air. After listening for a minute, the doctor stepped back, frowning. He looked at Kyle, and then he looked over at Kyle's mother, and then he told them that he heard crackling in Kyle's lungs, which indicated he very likely had a fluid buildup in his chest. He told them this was extremely unusual, especially for a healthy 17-year-old with no history of respiratory issues. So whatever was making Kyle sick, it had to be serious. Kyle just stared at the doctor in disbelief, and then between his ragged breaths, he asked the doctor if he was going to be okay. The doctor told Kyle not to panic, but they would have to run a whole battery of tests to figure out what was going on with him. The doctor said it was possible that Kyle had an autoimmune disease like lupus. However, the doctor thought it was far more likely that Kyle was suffering from some kind of infection. So the doctor said he was going to send an occupational hygienist to the Quitman's home to see if there was something in their environment that was making Kyle sick. Meanwhile, Kyle would need to spend the night at the hospital for testing. As Kyle listened to the scary-sounding things the doctor was saying, he found it very difficult to stay calm. If there was something deadly hidden in the Quitman residence, he knew he'd been breathing it in for 24 hours a day, nonstop for over a week. And the rest of his family could also be in serious danger too. The next morning, Kyle woke up in his hospital bed, trying not to move for fear that he would set off another coughing fit. Even though he was exhausted, he couldn't sleep the night before. Between the intense pain in his chest and the fear of what might be wrong with him, it had been very hard to relax. As he watched the TV to distract himself, his doctor gently knocked on the door frame and came inside. He told Kyle that he had some good news and bad news. The good news was, so far, all of Kyle's tests had come back negative, which ruled out an autoimmune disorder and a host of other diseases. But the bad news was, the occupational hygienist had found some possible causes for what was making Kyle sick. There were traces of mold in the Quitman's house, and the hygienist was also concerned about the family's pet cockatiel, Larry. Birds could carry all sorts of diseases, and their feathers could also set off severe respiratory issues, like what was happening to Kyle right now. When Kyle heard this, he just put his hands over his face and he groaned. He had most likely been breathing in that mold around the clock, and Larry the cockatiel had been keeping him company the entire time. Kyle asked the doctor if they'd have to get rid of their beloved bird in order to get better. The doctor shrugged and said he couldn't be sure yet. To find out what was actually infecting Kyle's lungs, they would have to insert a tube into Kyle's lungs to take a sample of the fluids. The doctor told him that that procedure is called a bronchoalveolar lavage, and when he said that, Kyle's eyes widened. Any procedure with a name that complicated had to be painful. But the doctor smiled when he saw Kyle's reaction, and he reassured him that he'd be asleep for the whole 2-hour procedure and he wouldn't feel a thing. Kyle was relieved. Now he just hoped that this test would get him the answers that he needed. Later that day, Kyle was back in his hospital room, still a bit groggy from the anesthesia from the procedure. But when the doctor came in, Kyle was aware enough to notice the very serious look on his doctor's face. The doctor said that, once again, he had good news and bad news. He said the good news was they found what was making Kyle sick, but it was not mold or Larry the cockatiel. For a moment, Kyle felt really happy that his beloved pet would not have to be exiled from the family home. But then the doctor told him the bad news. Kyle's lungs were infected with a toxic bacteria called Mycobacterium intracellular, which can be extremely dangerous. If left untreated, it could permanently damage his breathing and even cause heart failure. Before Kyle could freak out, the doctor said he was pretty sure they'd caught it early enough to avoid any serious health damage for Kyle and his family. But the Quitmans would not be safe until the source of this bacteria was located, and so the hygienist was heading back to Kyle's house right now to collect more samples. The next morning, Kyle's entire family gathered around his hospital bed while the doctor went over the hygienist's findings. The air and water samples that the hygienist had collected confirmed that the danger was coming from an unexpected place: the Quitman's indoor pool. The pool water was full of the same bacteria doctors found in Kyle's lungs, and every time people splashed around in the water, they were inadvertently spreading the bacteria up into the air. Kyle had gotten sick because he had been breathing in the unsanitary pool water. Kyle and his family would soon learn that this bacteria had been growing in their pool for months, basically right after they had switched to a different filtration system. So the entire family had been breathing in this bacteria, but Kyle got much sicker than everybody else because he was laid up on the couch right next to the pool room for 2 weeks, just sitting there breathing in that filth day in and day out. Kyle's unusual condition is known as hot tub lung, since most people get it from breathing in humid hot tub water. Kyle's family immediately had their pool deep cleaned, and they also installed a new filtration system. And pretty quickly, they all recovered and went back to their normal lives. But 2 years after the ordeal, the entire Quitman family went to a follow-up doctor's appointment and realized they had actually suffered permanent injury from their run-in with hot tub lung. Tests showed that all of their lungs now had a mild reduction in their ability to process poisonous carbon monoxide gas. It was a small but lingering reminder to make sure to always keep their pool nice and clean.
Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells. I heard the pot. I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open. I see the thing walk in. I watched it walk down the aisle. I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. When I was 16 years old, I was an avid snowboarder. Starting from the time I was like 12 years old, I used to always go snowboarding with the same 2 guys, my 2 very close friends, Wolf and Nick. Every winter, me, Nick, and Wolf would go up to Nick's family's cabin that was up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. We just snowboard, and it was great. Every time we went up to this cabin in New Hampshire, it would be me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom and dad. Unexpectedly, leading into my 16-year-old winter, Nick's father passed away. We were actually planning on going on a trip to the mountains that winter. And I remember speaking to Wolf and being like, I don't know if it's even appropriate to ask about this trip, because we knew that Nick was very close to his father, and not to mention, like, every time we went on this particular trip up to the mountains, Nick's dad was always with us, and it just seemed like, how can we possibly now go on this snowboarding trip? Not only is it a low priority item, but just the dynamic is all different now. Nick called us and was like, hey, so we are still going to do the snowboarding trip to the cabin in New Hampshire. And so, Wolf and I, we spoke and we're like, let's just go with it. I mean, maybe they want to do something that is maybe a fond memory of their father, their husband. And so we agreed to go. So he passes away maybe a few months before we end up going up to the mountains. And so the grief was still definitely there, but also just, again, that the dynamic was it was like the elephant in the room, right? Like as we're driving up, we drove in the same car, me, Wolf, Nick, and then Nick's mom was driving. It was so apparent that Nick's dad was missing because he was always in the car with us when we drove up. Anyhow, so we make the trip up to New Hampshire, and we're planning to be up there for 3 days. So the house itself wasn't really a cabin, it was a house, it was a small house. It was on a mountain, and if you think about the way a mountain works, it's a slope. And so in order to have a house level on a mountain, a portion of it needs to be on stilts, right? The portion that's kind of hanging off the mountain. And then the other part of the house is kind of like embedded in the mountain itself. And when you drive up to the house, there's a wraparound porch that goes around the house. The majority of it is on the stilted section of the house, right? So if you're on the wraparound porch, your footsteps are going to echo. Like you can hear those footsteps because you're above the ground. When you step into the house, you open a door. It actually opens inwardly. There were sleigh bells that were on the door, on the inside of the door. So anytime you open the door, you hear those sleigh bells ringing. And as soon as you step foot into the house, if you took one step into the house, right? So you step on the wraparound porch, you open the door, sleigh bells ring. When you step into the house, your right foot would be in the kitchen. You'd be standing on linoleum. And your left foot would be on shag carpet, which is like the dining room. And that's the way the house is laid out. As soon as you walk in, kitchen on your right, dining room on your left. And if you keep walking, you're going to enter into this living room. And if you turned around in the living room and looked up, you would see a lofted second floor. If you walk into the house, again, your right foot's in the kitchen, your left foot's in the dining room, and you walked as if you were going into that living space, but stopped about halfway across the house, you could look to your right and there'd be one hallway. There's only one hallway. It's a small house. And this hallway is bringing you, call it, into the mountain. If you think about, again, the layout of the house, you have a portion of the house that's sitting in the mountain and a portion of the house that's on stilts. Well, this hallway leads into the section of the house that's in the mountain. And if you go down this hallway and it turns left, it's a short little hallway, it brings you to one room. And that room is where me, Nick, and Wolf would stay every time we went snowboarding at this mountain. That room, if you go into it, it's a corner-fed room. You open the door, and immediately to your right is a bunk bed. I would always sleep on the bottom bunk, and Wolf would sleep on the top bunk. Our feet would be closest to the door. In the center of the room, with the remaining space, because this is not a big room, there was like a queen-size bed. It was like a slightly larger bed that sat basically in all of the free space that was left over in the room. It was sitting right in the middle of the room. And that's where Nick would sleep. So basically the room was completely packed with 3 places to sleep and really not much else. There was a very small space between the queen size bed and the bunk bed. So you could walk between those two, but that was about it. So that layout's very important, and you'll see why. We snowboard for the day, we come back to the cabin, and me, Nick, and Wolf decide we're gonna crash super early and get up early and have a full day of riding ahead of us, because we're avid snowboarders. So we go to our room, the one that's kind of, you go down that hallway and you get to the room I just described. We planned on going to bed early, but we were excited, and so we stayed up gaming for a bit. And then maybe around like 11 or 12 o'clock at night, Nick, who again is in the queen size bed, and Wolf was in the top bunk, they ultimately fall asleep. I was still awake, and what struck me, and it always struck me whenever I slept in this room, is when you turn off all the electronics and you're just laying in bed in this house, in particular this room, it is pitch black. There's no windows. You're in the segment of the house that's, in the mountain. It is truly pitch black. Not to mention the house itself, there weren't really any neighbors nearby, because this house, Nick's family had purchased it a while ago when this used to be an active ski resort, the mountain itself that it was on. But it wasn't anymore, and most people that were living there had left and sold their property. But a few people had decided to stay, and so Nick's family was one of them. So they had this cabin on an abandoned ski resort. There was virtually no streetlights, there's virtually no neighbors, and so at night, when you're laying in this room, like I was this night, you're really struck by just how dark and quiet it is. I mean, basically no white noise, silence and pitch black. And so I'm laying there, and one other detail that needs to be brought up before we get into what actually happens. So Nick had two much older brothers. They were in their 30s, and we're 16 years old. And we were expecting one of them, we didn't know which, to swing by the house at some point over the next few days. That's what Nick's mom had said. Nick had kind of reiterated it. And I think that Wolf and I understood that, now that Nick's father was gone, that they were just kind of trying to find a way to fill the void that was left from the father passing. And so we were expecting over the course of that weekend for someone, one of the two brothers, to come to this house and stay with us for a night or whatever it was. I had never met either of these two brothers. I knew they existed, but I had never met them before. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I know that probably one of them is going to show up at some point, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, whenever it is. Man, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about this. So that night, as I'm laying in bed, I'm thinking about how dark and quiet it is. I remember the only light in the room was the digital clock, the little red digital clock, and it was like a beacon in the light. And that doesn't emit much light, but when it's pure darkness, it does. And I just could not fall asleep. I remember I got to a place where I started counting how many hours of sleep I might get if I fell asleep right then and there, which is never a good sign. That means you're not close to sleeping. If you're like, okay, if I fell asleep now, I'll get 3 hours and 22 minutes of sleep, right? Like that's where I was at mentally. At some point, I think it was around 3 a.m, I remember looking at the clock and thinking, wow, it's gotten so late and I'm still awake. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch. In a situation where, as I'm telling it, you're going to think, how did you not raise, a red flag immediately? In real time, in real life, your brain goes to great measures to convince you that everything is okay. It really takes an enormous amount of anomalies to stack up for your brain to say something's wrong. And so that's what happened in this first night. I hear footsteps on the wraparound porch, and I immediately assume, even though we're talking, it's like 3 a.m, I just assume that it's got to be one of Nick's brothers arriving to be a part of this weekend getaway. So I really actually didn't think anything of it. I actually just thought, well, when he comes in the house, if he happens to come in here to check on us, I'll just pretend to be asleep in case, he were to see that I was awake. I don't want to have a conversation with him. Number one, it's 3 a.m. Number two, I don't know the guy. I'm just going to pretend to be asleep. So that's all I'm thinking about. Not worried, not scared, not anything. Footsteps on the wraparound porch, and then the door opens, and I can hear the sleigh bells that are on the door itself. I can hear those chime as the door opens. Again, no part of me is concerned about this. I'm thinking it's a little bit weird that they're arriving at 3 a.m, but we knew that his brothers had these weird work schedules where they might show up in the middle of the night. So it was just, it was whatever it was. Sleigh bells ring, and then I hear what sounds like a pot, like a kitchen pot, fall and hit the linoleum floor in the kitchen. And I remember just the sound stood out to me. It just seemed like this person's kind of making a bit of a commotion in the middle of the night here. And the door didn't shut. And I noticed that. I figured they were maybe bringing their stuff in, right? They're offloading some stuff. And they're leaving the door open. Oh, this is, just thinking about this, it's really making me feel uncomfortable. So I hear the footsteps in the wraparound porch, the door opens, I can hear the sleigh bells, a pot falls and it hits the linoleum floor. The footsteps that I could hear on the wraparound porch, because it's on stilts, right? Like the porch is hovering over the ground. You can hear those footsteps. Well, when these footsteps continued into the house, where you're on a concrete slab and there should be no sound, like I shouldn't hear echoing footsteps, it sounded like it was on the wraparound porch still, but the noise was getting closer to me. So it was like the footsteps sounded totally natural out on the wraparound porch, but once they were in the house, it didn't really make any sense that I could hear them as if as if the footsteps were standing on something that was suspended off the ground. But it wasn't. You're in the house on a concrete slab. And so I hear these footsteps. The door hasn't shut. The front door is wide open. We're in the middle of winter here. We're in the middle of nowhere, too. And I'm thinking about that, but I'm still thinking it's got to be Nick's brother, one of Nick's brothers. The footsteps continue through the house. And they stop about halfway through the house. If you open that door and walk halfway through the house. And then the footsteps began to walk down the hallway towards our room. So they come down the hall. And they get right outside the door, which is shut. The door to our room is shut. And I'm sitting there. Again, my feet are closest to the door. It's pitch black in the room, minus the, digital clock. And I'm thinking, why didn't they shut the front door? Of all the weird things that have happened, the fact that I'm hearing footsteps as if they're on the wraparound porch, but they're getting louder and moving through the house, the thing that really just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was, why didn't they shut the front door? That just seems like such a bad idea. There's animals out there. There's a host of things out there. Like, why aren't you shut? And not to mention, it's freezing outside. There's a space between the bunk bed, the bottom bunk that I'm on, and the top bunk. There's a space that I can see clear as day. Whoever walks in the room, I'm gonna see them when they walk past the foot of the bed. But because of the top bunk, my view is actually obscured, and I wouldn't be able to make out someone's face, for example. I could really only see their middle section. And so when the door opens and this shadow figure walks into the room, which, by the way, I'm in a pitch black room, and I clearly make out a black silhouette. This thing walks into the room, and it's obscured, so I wouldn't have been able to see its head or upper body anyways, but its hips are so high that I can't even really see those. Those are at the level that I would expect someone's upper body or head to be at, meaning this figure that's walked in, its legs are extremely long. And so if it was proportionally the size of a human, you're talking about maybe a 10-foot tall person, but we're in a space that is not a 10-foot high ceiling. And so this thing walks in, and as soon as I see it, and I make out that black silhouette, even though it's pitch black in the room, I clearly see the silhouette that is unnaturally tall, combined with all the things that I've just thought about, mainly the door's still open. They'd made kind of a commotion. I can hear these weird footsteps. I instantly was frozen with terror. Frozen. Petrified. I'm like, it's not Nick's brother. And even if we're not talking about paranormal here, this is such a bad situation. Even if that's just some dude who's come into the house, that's a really bad situation. So no matter what, this is a really bad situation, but what I'm looking at doesn't make sense. It's an unnaturally tall person. They've left the door open, and I hear their footsteps all over the house, and it walks in past the foot of the bed. And I'm laying there, and I can't see higher than its waist because it's obscured by the top bunk. And this thing makes this facing movement, like a military facing movement, and begins to walk down the aisle between the queen size bed in the middle of the room and the bunk bed where I am. And it's walking down right next to me, and I'm literally sitting there unable to move. And I remember thinking, I can't do anything. I'm truly frozen with terror. And all I remember thinking is, whatever happens, just don't bend down and look at me. That will ruin my life. If this thing so much as looks at me, that's it, I'm done. So it walks down the aisle, it's right next to me. I'm literally frozen. And it does another quick movement, but it's facing away from me now. Facing towards Nick in the center of the room. And it bows onto and then down through Nick's bed and disappears. In a movie, as soon as the ghost disappears into the floor, whoever's hiding would make a run for it. In real life, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as people disappearing into the ground. So I'm expecting this thing to just get back up again. I couldn't understand that it was, did it disappear into the bed? That's not possible. Where is it? I heard the door open. I heard the bells, I heard the pot, I heard the footsteps. I saw the door open, I see the thing walk in, I watched it walk down the aisle, I watched it bend over. It's in the room. Where is it? And for hours, all night, I laid there absolutely petrified, expecting this thing to come back up and just look at me. That was my biggest fear, is whatever this thing was, I did not want it to look at me. So that was the worst. I'm laying there frozen. I can only move my eyes all night. Finally, I hear Nick's mom out in the living room making coffee. This was probably like 5, 6 in the morning. And it was like the first time that I'm like, okay, I'm safe now. Even if it's in the room, I'm safe to just go because I can hear someone out there. And I could hear her speaking. I knew it was her. And so I go right out there. And now you got to understand that even though this was a horrible situation that I still can't really explain, I know that she has just lost her husband. And so the idea of approaching this subject, which effectively is going to turn into ghosts, right? I've never had a paranormal experience before this. I've never had a paranormal experience since, right? Like I'm more or less a skeptic, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to start talking about ghosts to the woman who's recently bereaved. It just felt really inappropriate. And so I was really struggling with how I wanted to communicate what happened. And so I went to the table, she got me a cup of coffee, and and we know each other well, she knows me well. And she definitely picked up that something was wrong, but didn't really ask anything yet. She was just kind of puzzling, like kind of sizing me up a little bit. And the only thing I could think to do was to just ask, hey, did either of your two sons, Nick's older two brothers, did they stop by at any point last night? Did they stop by? And she's like, no. And I'm sitting there like, okay. And I'm just like, I must have had a reaction that was obvious to her. And she just goes, I heard my husband here last night too. And, that made it a lot worse. Because on the one hand, you have a situation where she is confirming something that part of me hopes is a bad dream. Number two, she's now saying it's her husband. And so I intuitively assumed that she has somehow figured out what I'm stressed about that probably isn't real. And because she's grieving, she's created a story where her husband is now in the house, looking over us. I really believed that she didn't hear anything. That she just somehow understood that I had this weird feeling and she'd turned it into my husband's in the house. And I just couldn't ask any more questions at that point. I felt like I had set her up for this awkward exchange. I felt really bad that that was the discussion we were having. I also thought if that's true, I don't want to have this conversation. I really was just dumbfounded on what to do in this situation. And this is night 1. There's 2 more nights of this, and it gets worse. So Nick and Wolf eventually come out of the bedroom, and they come to the dining room. And the same way I felt reserved talking to Nick's mom about what happened, I had the same feelings about Nick, because it was his father. And I also just felt like that would be inappropriate. But Wolf, he's not a family member, and he's my buddy, and I kind of pulled him aside, and I kind of told him what was going on as best as I could. I kept it kind of generic. I was like, I could have sworn I heard someone in the house last night. I could have sworn. And he's like, yeah, you're probably dreaming. That's what this is. And I was like, no, I wasn't, but I can't make sense of it. And I was like, can you just do me a favor? And at this point, Nick actually overheard the conversation, and I very much cut ties with what I was talking about. I was like, yeah, I just thought I heard something last night. It's just me freaking myself out. And I was like, can you guys tonight, when we get back from snowboarding, can I fall asleep ahead of you? That way I'm asleep, you guys can just fall asleep after I do, and then I'll sleep through the night, no big deal. And they're like, all right, yeah, weirdo, whatever. So I'm like, all right, my big plan is I'm just gonna go to bed really, really early. Because I didn't sleep the night before, so I'm thinking, I'll fall asleep right away. So we go out, we snowboard for the day, my mind is off of what happened, and frankly, I'm starting to convince myself that That had to have been, sleep paralysis. Even though I'd never had that before, I was Googling some stuff, maybe sleep paralysis. Maybe it was just like a really intense dream. I would just there has to be something. Like this is too weird. It has to be something explainable. Turns out it wasn't. We get back from snowboarding, and I am immediately going to bed. Pretty much immediately. It was like maybe 6 o'clock. I was like, I'm going to bed. And I get in bed, and all I'm thinking about is what happened the night before, and I can't fall asleep. Eventually, Nick and Wolf, they come in the room, and they're trying their best to stay awake so that I can fall asleep, but it's getting later, and I can't fall asleep. And now I'm back to that, okay, if I fall asleep now, I get 6 hours of sleep. And they finally just said, hey man, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. So they both fall asleep, and I'm awake. And I was so upset with myself. You screwed yourself. Why didn't you just fall asleep, you dummy? And I remember the only thing that I did that really made this real, looking back at it, is I put a knife, like a kitchen knife or something, in the springs above me. So I'm in the bottom bunk, basically right under the top bunk. I put a knife in there. And I'm laying in bed, and I'm constantly looking over at the digital clock. And it was probably around 3 a.m. It was late enough that it was okay, this is about the time that happened last night. And my heart just sunk when I heard those footsteps on the wraparound porch again. They sounded the same as they did the night before. I was like, that has to be one of Nick's brothers. But the door opens, I hear the sleigh bells, I hear the frickin' pot fall on the ground. It was like deja vu. The exact same thing is happening. And these footsteps start walking through the house. And again, referencing how movies would portray this, the person who's me in the movie is like, okay, I'm going to get this knife and I'm going to position myself over here because I know what's going to happen and I'm going to protect myself. In real life, I'm like, this thing's going to be in my room, potentially. It happened last night. It's apparently happening again. Please, for the love of God, don't bow into me the way it bowed into the floor the night before. Don't look at me. It will ruin my life if some entity just engages with me, just looks at me. That will ruin my life. This thing walks down the hall, and I hear those footsteps coming down the hall. And just pretend for a second, forget the paranormal aspect. Pretend it's the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, and a stranger is walking around your house. That alone is horrifying. The footsteps come right outside the door, and I'm looking at the knife that's right underneath the bed. And I'm petrified. I cannot move. I'm drenched in sweat. Just from the few seconds that it's taken this thing to go from the door to the front of my bedroom. Because I know what's happening again. It's happening again. I'm not crazy. It's just happening again. What the F is this? And I'm petrified. I can't reach. I'm so worried about making any noise that would alert this thing that I'm here. That I can only move my eyes. And I remember even thinking that I shouldn't move my eyes too quickly because it might hear that. This is a primal level of fear. The door opens, it walks into the room, goes right past the foot of my bed, and I'm, again, petrified. And it walks down, after making its facing movement, it walks down the aisle between me and Nick. And I remember what happened the night before, where it folded into Nick and disappeared, and I'm just thinking to myself, please don't turn and bow into me. Please, whatever happens, just don't do that. So it turns away from me and does the same thing it did the night before, folds onto Nick and disappears into the ground. But again, even though in the movies, this would be the same thing happening, night 2, it's the same routine. It'd be like, oh, the ghost is in the floor now. I can go alert the authorities because now it's safe. In real life, I'm like, where did it go? I know this happened last night, but it still doesn't make any sense. It's in the room. It has to be. This is a real thing. It came in the room. It's somewhere. Is it under my bed? Where is it? All night, I lay there. This is the second night that I've not slept. When I heard Nick's mom out in the other room, it was like such a relief. Because I didn't give a crap at this point about being polite. I wasn't gonna like try to, distance myself from the conversation around ghosts. I was gonna go out there and be like, what's wrong with this house? And so I hear her and I go right out to the living room and I tell her everything in as acute detail as I possibly can. And as I'm telling her this, her reaction didn't line up. Her reaction was not surprise, terror, confusion. It was empathy. She felt bad for me. It was sympathy. You don't understand. Like, I'm listening, but you just don't understand what's happening. And I'm telling her every detail I can possibly muster. And at the end of it, or towards the end, she just kind of stops me. She's like, John, I told you yesterday, and again, I heard it last night. That's just my husband. I heard him last night too. You got nothing to worry about. And I was like, no. That cannot be. Cannot be what it is. And she was like, I heard him open the door. I heard the pot fall. I heard him walk through the house. I'm assuming he went into Nick's room again with you guys. And I'm like, what is happening? So totally now just beside myself. I remember I was crying actually. Like during this conversation, I'm just crying. Not even like tears of sadness as much as just like, what's happening? Like I needed my mom. Like I felt so helpless. And no offense to Nick's mom, but I just felt like I was with a lunatic. How? But like at the same time, she's recalling the exact same things as me. How do I put that together? I remember thinking I need to leave. I need to get out of here. I can't be here anymore. But then I thought about like, how am I going to make this happen? Nick's mom and Wolf and Nick, they're not leaving today. And it was pretty clear that Nick's mom liked the fact that she, heard her husband walking around the cabin. She's not trying to leave. There's one more night that we're here, and I would have to tell my parents to drive, my mom or my dad, to drive to New Hampshire and come get me because I'm seeing ghosts. Like, this was a trip that I loved. I looked forward to this trip every year. It wouldn't have made any sense, and they would have been like, what's wrong with you? And I honestly was not prepared to have those conversations with my mom and dad. I was not prepared to be like, let me tell you about the ghost I saw over the past 2 days. And so I was just kind of resigned and decided to stay. In retrospect, I think I should have called my parents and been like, that's what parents are for. Like, get the hell up here. It doesn't matter why. Come get me. But it was such a confusing moment that I had no blueprint for how to handle. So I just stayed. Nick and Wolf finally get up. And I remember I made that decision as I'm sitting there thinking about what's happening, is Nick's mom is reassuring me, about her husband being in the house. And I make the decision that I'm going to stay. Nick and Wolf come out of the room, and they come over, and Wolf pretty much immediately looks at me to get a gauge on what happened. And you can see it all over my face. I've been crying. And I told them what happened. And, Nick was always kind of a stoic, and he was just unaffected, Wolf, on the other hand, was more inclined to, at a minimum, believe something was happening. He didn't know if it was a ghost or not, but he certainly understood that something's going on. And the fact that Nick's mom, as I'm explaining to Nick and Wolf what's going on, she was like reinforcing my argument. Yeah, I heard him too. I heard the door open. Yeah, I was upstairs. I heard him walk through the house. And Wolf's like, what's going on? And Nick is like, he didn't want to hear it, kind of. It probably was uncomfortable. It's about his father, or ultimately talking about his father. Before we went out snowboarding for the day, because Nick's mom would drive us and drop us off, she brought us to a local store, and we bought a coffee table because they've been looking to replace the one that was in their house. Basically, when you walk into the house, instead of turning down the hallway towards our room, if you just keep walking into the lofted area, at the foot of the stairs was a coffee table where they kept a landline phone because you're in the middle of nowhere and you got to have some way to call, and they put it right at the foot of the stairs on this little coffee table. But it had broken, or it was old, or whatever. I know they wanted a new one for a long time. We went out and got it. Me, Nick, and Wolf, we snowboard. We come back. We help offload the coffee table into the house. We put it at the foot of the stairs. And that night, we go to bed. I was ruthless in trying to keep Wolf and Nick awake. I mean, I wasn't even trying to make jokes out of it. I was like straight up kicking the bunk, kicking Wolf's bunk, like literally shaking Nick. I was doing everything in my power to keep them awake because I couldn't sleep. I'm terrified. It was like the opposite of how excited you get before Christmas and you can't sleep. It was like the opposite of those feelings, but you still can't sleep. It was like, this is the worst night of my life. And also, the nail in the coffin, if you will, is during the day that day, we found out that neither of Nick's two brothers were going to be making the trip. They weren't going to make it. So no one's going to be at the house. No one should be at the house except for us. And so that night I'm laying there, and after all my attempts to keep Nick and Wolf awake, they fall asleep. Everyone's asleep. The house is pitch black. It's silent. And around 2, 3 in the morning, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I hear those footsteps on the wraparound porch. The door opens and I hear the sleigh bells ringing on the door. A pot falls on the ground and the footsteps walk into the house. And this is the third time that this has happened. So in a way, this was the first time that I was expecting something to happen. For it to walk down the hall, to come in the room, to come next to me, fold into Nick, and then that's it. This was the first time I had a little bit of, call it security, that something was going to happen, and I understood what was going to happen. I didn't understand it, but I expected something to happen. But this was not the case this night. It walked into the house. Everything was the same. It walked into the house, but instead of going down the hallway towards our room, it kept walking into the lofted area. And the lofted area, from where I was laying, my foot's at the door, my head's back here, the wall straight, if I sat up in bed and looked straight, the wall right there led into the area where this thing was. So I'm basically, if there wasn't a wall, I'd be looking dead at this thing. And I'm waiting for it to walk through the wall. As crazy as that sounds, I'm just anticipating something coming through the wall. After a long pause of it being in that lofted area, I hear it go up the steps. Listening to the creak of the steps as it goes up the steps, it makes my skin crawl. It's making me emotional thinking about how terrifying that was. It walks up the stairs, and now it's above me. And if the past 2 nights are any example, this thing has sunk into the ground 2 nights in a row and disappeared. And so now my fear is it's going to literally come through the ceiling, through the bunk, onto me. The sound stopped when it was upstairs. Got upstairs, and that's where Nick's mom slept. She was upstairs. So I laid in bed, petrified once again. I got my stupid knife sitting in the underside of the bed above me. And hours and hours of waiting for my literal worst nightmare to come true as some entity comes through the ceiling and goes into me, or even just if it was like onto Nick, if it came through the ceiling and if out of my peripheries I'm watching like this beast come through the ceiling and float down and into Nick. It just, all these thoughts in my head, they didn't make any sense. They were terrifying, but they were happening. I laid in bed and I couldn't fall asleep. I was now coming up on 3 days without sleep. So at some point that night, I did fall asleep, probably just out of sheer exhaustion. At some point in the morning, early morning, now probably like 5 in the morning, I wake up again and I can hear Nick's mom. It didn't sound like she was making coffee. It sounded like something was wrong. I couldn't place it, but it just sounded like she was acting emotional somehow. I couldn't tell if she was crying or not. But now it's like, it's the morning, it's my last day, I'm leaving today, I'm up, I'm out. And as soon as I walk out of the hallway and I look to the left into the dining room where I expect to see Nick's mom, and she's not there. And she's actually over at the foot of the stairs in the lofted kind of living room area next to this new coffee table we had just put in. And she's standing over this coffee table at the foot of the stairs where the entity had been the night before, the one deviation from the other 2 nights. And she's crying. Come here. She points to the coffee table. And she's down on her knees looking at the table. And now I can tell she's probably crying tears of joy. Because scratched into the coffee table were the words, "I love you." I was like, I'm done. That ended my friendships with certainly Nick. Wolf to a lesser degree, but I stopped snowboarding. I didn't go back to that cabin, even though I know Wolf did the next year. The theories about what happened, Nick's mom, it's possible she could have created a narrative, made it about her husband, and then she could have just as easily scratched that into the table. The "I love you," that could have been her. It's also possible that